Hi folks, this is our first discussion of the Postmortal by Drew McGarry. So we're going to be using tools from our short stories in order to analyze and engage with this dystopia. Okay, as we've talked about our other readings, each of the stories is different insofar as they highlight different intentions and context by the authors. And with this text, we're going to be engaging with a variety. So today we're going to get historical context and factoids for the kind of themes I'm going to encourage us to engage with. Of course, whatever you get out of the text is great, but I just want to kind of set us up a bit so you know what I think is interesting about it and kind of hope to shape for us. Okay, so for this text, the author is Drew McGarry. It was published in the last decade, at the beginning of it. Our topics here are going to engage with apocalyptic features of social collapse. So we haven't had that so far in our story, so this is going to be an interesting, different direction to go. I've been trying to engage with a variety of dystopias here. Also, some interesting things are the ethics of medical intervention. So when we get to have kind of radically new technologies of medicine and when it's ethical to provide them to the public, right? And when we shouldn't. Also with this text, we're going to get the meaning of life and death. So when it's appropriate to die, what the shape of life should be. And those are topics we haven't really engaged with yet. So in this full-length novel, we can kind of get a more lengthy discussion into more complex topics. Okay, so to kick this off, we're going to be talking about radical life extension. So this is different than, say, doing a cancer treatment that will extend your life by, say, like 10, 15 years. So you can make it to like 80 or 90 degrees, right? So that's our typical lifespan now, right? A radical life extension intervention would get you to like 200, 500 years old. Okay, so that's the radical part. It's like major life extension, a lot longer, right? Okay, so that's going to be a major theme in our text. So I want to give us some historical context by what we mean by a life expectancy and things like that. Okay, so let's talk about human lifespans. So the context here, we're going to talk about issues with the lives or the length of human lives. Okay, so we're going to talk about this a little bit. You had an optional reading to get this going a little bit, but I want to talk about it a little more. So first, we do need this distinction. So a lot of the times when we're having casual discussion or something like that, we use the term life expectancy. Technically speaking, life expectancy is the average age babies born in a year can expect to reach. Okay, so like this year in the US, the average child will be expected to reach about 72. Okay, so in the US, the life expectancy is 72. That's very different than the maximum lifespan. Okay, that's the longest any known member of a species either is known to live or can be expected to reach, we could also say. Okay, so we could talk about a geographical area, right? So in the US, the maximum lifespan is a lot more than 72, right? We know people, you probably know people who have lived past that. But that's different than how much the average child can be expected to reach. What's interesting is just how divergent those two standards are, those two data are. So a maximum lifespan, we haven't actually made a lot of progress on. So since ancient Egypt, it's been about 80, and we've made maybe like 40 years progress on that, right? I think don't quote me on this, but the oldest living person in the last like 20 years or so typically is around like 115, 120. Don't quote me on that. Okay, so we haven't made much progress on that. We're talking like 4,000 years ago, it was 80, right? So that's not very much, even with all the medical interventions that we now have. We have done a lot, on the other hand, with life expectancy, but almost solely since 1900. Okay, so let's break that down just in case you like data, but also to hammer home that point. Okay, so prepare yourself for some wordy PowerPoints, but we're going to go through them pretty quickly. There we go. There's the wordy PowerPoint. It's going to be okay though. Okay, so life expectancy, which unfortunately is Eurocentric. I'm sorry, but just to have kind of like a standard going through here. Also, more written data about it. Okay, so in the Stone Age in Southern Europe, most babies died before they reached the age of 2. And remember, with life expectancy, we start at birth. This makes it kind of an unfortunate standard. So the average life expectancy was probably not more than 20, we think. Okay. Then we hit Rome for our next stop here with life expectancy. At the height of the empire, it was about 25, right? So we've added 20 years with a hell of a lot of development here. We have some kind of medical interventions. We have some kind of science going on. There's some naturalists now, 5 years more. In the Middle Ages, we've got universities. We have Oxford, Cambridge, Bologna, say like in 1000 CE, right? I'd like to point out that if we go outside of Europe, we can hit more than 30, okay? So in China around the Yellow River and in Mexico, we could get a bit more than 30. Not a super lot more, like would still be below 40, but sources have suggested that that's the case. Okay, so when the first universities were founded, we hit about 30 in Europe. Okay, so again, it takes about 1,000 years to get 5 years better. Then let's jump to the Renaissance. So we're about 500 to 600 years past that. We get another 3 years. Okay, then Georgian England, let's add another 300 years to that. Okay, and we're 40, but less in the colonized world because basically the UK, Spain, and the Netherlands are, you know, hurting. Like we've diminished the life expectancy in the imperialized nations, the colonized nations. By 1900, the most imperialist countries like England and the US, the life expectancy rose to 47. But again, it was lower in colonized places, okay? So in fact, as you can probably predict, the life expectancy in places influenced by imperialization had been lowered at that point. So it was, it seems like from records, it had been increasing more. So those are some side notes just in order to put the Eurocentric aspect here into some context. Okay, so here's the upshot of this slide. In thousands of years, according to the scale of life expectancy, we've done a bit more than doubled it. That's not impressive, right? So by 1900, from the Stone Age to then, we rose to 47. Okay. Then we could consider this to be a big leap. Okay, so again, 1990, the life expectancy was 47, but by the end of the 20th century, in imperialist and colonizing countries, we'd reached 76 years for life expectancy. So that could sound really impressive. One side note though, that's tripling the life expectancy from the so-called wild, right? So when we talk about the Stone Age, we're talking about using more developed tools. We're talking about living in groups where the tasks have been divided socially instead of having everybody do all the tasks, right? So those are the things we're trying to identify. So this isn't a distinction between hunter-gatherers and agrarian societies by any means, or nomadic societies and agrarian societies. There's just something that we could say about the wild to something like more developed social groups. So we can do the same for a field mouse, taking a variety of animals from the wild and then tripling their life expectancy, right? In a more controlled environment. And basically we've developed for ourselves a more controlled environment. So it becomes a little less impressive, especially because it took us to 1990 to the 20th century. So you could look at that in a variety of different ways. But let's note that life expectancy, this probably isn't like a shock to you that I've been building to this, life expectancy might not be the most helpful metric to use. So here's how we might think of this. Approximately 2% of babies born in the Elizabethan period, so this is around the Renaissance, in Europe, died before the end of their first day. Okay, so 2% isn't very much, but your first day is pretty radical, right? It's going to diminish the life expectancy. But it's not just that first day percentage. A cumulative total of 5%, so that's including those 2%, died within the first week, about 9% within a month, and 12 or 13% of infants are dying within a year. Okay, and the rate of infant mortality actually went up between the late 1500s and into the late 1600s. Okay, so when we're using the life expectancy metric, we're talking about from birth, how long can you be expected to live? 13% of children aren't living past a year. That's bringing the life expectancy way down, right? So that's why we have two other metrics. The first one that typically is used is the life expectancy of people alive at the age X, right? So this one you probably have heard of before, right? So if people reach the age of, say, 12, then their life expectancy can be something like 57, right? But if from birth, somebody's life expectancy could be like 35, right? So the key there for that metric is to decide which age is most relevant. And that's where the science of gerontology, or the science of age, gets the most contentious typically. So like, which age is the most significant to have that X be? Okay, so that's why I haven't focused on this E sub X is the technical way of approaching that. But the life expectancy of people alive at the age X is a more helpful, typically, metric than just brute life expectancy, because so many people throughout history have died young, right? But how young we should look at that data typically is very contentious. Okay. But also what we've talked about is the maximum lifespan. Sorry, that is a typo. The maximum lifespan is a different metric, and we haven't made as much progress with that one as the life expectancy of people who have made it. Okay, so that's context for the progress that we've made in keeping people alive more, basically, right? So the context of our making progress, typically with living conditions, just like that field mouse coming out of the wild and into a controlled environment, right? So we get better at eating more nutritious food, right? Protecting ourselves from the elements, right? So just living conditions will expand our lives. Also, we're getting better at medical interventions. So it was a great thing. It was a great leap forward in Europe, for instance, to separate our living situation and our toilet situation, right? Like basically the rest of the world had figured that out, and so they were having super less amounts of cholera and dysentery and things like that. But it took, late into the Middle Ages for France and England to figure this out. Okay, so that's just like living conditions improving makes life expectancy, if you live to a certain age, increase, right? And then this leap forward in the 1900s and later typically is attributed to medical intervention, right? We've got penicillin. We've got a whole host of other medicine. We developed surgery, right? In the 1800s, hand washing, theories of germs, right? All of these medical theories and medical interventions came about that made us live longer. So throughout history, and especially in the last 150 years, there's been this idea of, can we just make us live not even to our maximum lifespan, but a whole bunch longer than that, maybe twice our maximum lifespan, right? So with radical life extension, the idea is, what we mean by that is, look, say our maximum lifespan is 80 or 120 now, right? So we've added 40 years on to what it was in ancient Egypt. There are two kind of schools of thought here, and that's what this slide is about. Some people are like, yes, radical life extension will be, because aging is unfortunate, death is unfortunate, we should be preventing or curing age/death, right? So just as we've been putting effort into improving life conditions and treating aging, treating disease, we should also be trying to cure aging or death or something like that. We should be putting it off as long as possible. So here I have prolongivists, right? So you're prolonging life. Yay, pro-life extension. Yay, radical life extension, right? So that's their attitude. That can come from a lot of things, either like a fear of death, life is good, so let's have more of it, right? A lot of people in this camp see aging just as the same thing as all of our other diseases. Like it's not just a separate process that's natural, it's another thing that goes wrong in the body, so why wouldn't we treat it, right? So that's the prolongivist camp. But then this other camp is the apologists. So in the technical sense, an apologist, or to give an apology in like the philosophical sense or in the even etymological sense, so what the word means is to explain away or defend. Okay, so an apologist defends the shape of our lives, defends the idea that death is natural, that our lifespans are natural. So here I have apologists, boo and nay radical life extension. So it's okay that we live as we do, or that we die as we do. Okay, so according to the apologists, right, they're apologizing, they're defending the shape of our lives. It would be wrong or inappropriate in some way to attempt to radically prolong life. So they're not against the medical interventions that we have now. Okay, they're not against like cancer treatments, kidney transplants, antibiotics, right? But what they are against is taking our maximum lifespan, say now, and attempting to double it. That's something like radical life extension. They think that's not an appropriate thing to do. Okay, so, right. So here are the reasons that you might be in one camp or another. So they typically disagree about what the role of medicine is. And I kind of touched on this quickly, right? So if you think the role of medicine is to treat diseases, then you're all about like penicillin, kidney transplants, flu shots, right? There is a disease and you'd like to treat it or prevent a disease, right? So if you can say this person is in ill health, you can make them in better health. Other people think the role of medicine is to prolong life. Here's any condition that could make life shorter. We want to make life longer, right? So with the second bullet point, you see health versus disease. If you see medicine as disease prevention, that's different, right? So disease prevention here is one thing. But if we have a distinction between promoting life, right, and a standard of medicine as just creating well-being, then that's in sync with the prolongivists, right? So treating disease versus prolonging life is one idea of the difference in role of medicine. Another is, well, medicine doesn't, another distinction between them that could divide them, there isn't a very easy distinction between health and disease. For instance, medicine doesn't just deal with you when you're diseased. Medicine has the task of dealing with, for instance, pregnant women. They are not diseased, but they could be said to be having medical interventions, especially if we broaden medical to include like midwifery and things like that. But there's been really great reorientation in the US, especially to demedicalize pregnancy, or there's a lot of different frameworks for thinking of things as medical in a way that we're not automatically treating everybody as diseased that needs medicine. Okay, so different views on the role of medicine. If you have more of a positive, like preventative, or a life-preserving view of medicine versus an eliminative, like you're eliminating something bad view of medicine, but you're not cultivating good view of medicine. That can make you either a prolongivist or an apologist. Another one is what kind of radical life extension are we talking about? Um, could make you one or the other, right? Um, would you be prolonging like just being old or being in a period of senescence, which is the period of aging um, indefinitely, right? What kind of intervention are we talking about, right? So there was a lot of talk in the early 21st century about having nano robots that would go in and do surgery for you or like repair your cells and keep them going forever. Right now we're talking about CRISPR-Cas9, which is a really targeted intervention that would keep your that would prevent your genes from manifesting any disease that we have genetically tagged. Another way that people have talked about radical life extension is a kind of virtual life where we upload your personhood, basically. So that's a more radical and theoretical kind of life extension, right? So there are a lot of different ways of thinking about this. A final way that you might consider issues that would make you a prolongivist versus an apologist, whether you're in favor of radical life extension or not, would be this consideration that gets talked about a lot. It's like, okay, if we had radical life extension in our society, a lot of people are like, wait, that would lead to population growth, and then we'd have these environmental concerns because everybody would be using up all these resources. Okay, just to note that environmental justice folks and economists that are concerned with population growth and things like this don't treat this, especially the environmental justice folks, and I'm one of them. I'm an ethical philosopher. I'm an ethicist, and that's one of my specialties. This isn't actually something that bears addressing. So if you're concerned about the environment or like resource consumption because of population growth, right? This is kind of framing the issue in a kind of misleading way. So if you're like, okay, look, let's track consumers of resources. And so more consumers would lead to more consumption and therefore limited resources. That's an overly simplified or simplistic way of considering things. It doesn't actually work in like a one-to-one relationship. Okay, if we look at, especially just in practice, the places in our world, unfortunately, the places that population is growing are the places that folks aren't consuming a lot of resources. And the people who are consuming a lot of resources are the uber wealthy. Okay, so the projected population growth in the next hundreds of years can be offset by reducing the consumption by the wealthy, like really easily. So the two things that actually would be most productive to reduce resource consumption and carbon emissions is to reduce the amount of consumption by the wealthy, not actually doing anything for population growth. So this typically is in environmental justice groups seen as kind of a red herring because it's not growing a population, it's more inequality that is a concern for resource depletion and carbon emissions. So if we track consumers of resources or the overconsumption of resources, we can deal with a lot more people. But we can't deal with the rate that individual uber wealthy folk are consuming. So that's one thing. Also, though, we can't get rid of the fact that in practice, when you find concerns and discussions about population, any solution to that and any discussion about that typically comes about with racism, xenophobia, or eugenics. So when you start talking about especially controlling populations or identifying different groups where population is a quote problem, it's really difficult to do. And historically, it hasn't been done without having racist, xenophobic, or eugenic undertones. And so in practice, it's really problematic, but also the concern doesn't really justify the discussions that typically are had. So I just want to kind of note that because we are going to be diving into a book where the author points to a lot of resource depletion as a result of radical life extension. So this is something I kind of want to consider throughout the book. How does this disaster kind of unfold? What is he suggesting? Does it and we're going to be discussing this further, but how do these environmental concerns manifest? Is it because a lot of stuff has gone badly, or is it just is the author saying it's a necessary result of radical life extension? So we can talk about that more. Feel free to bring it up in the discussions, and I have ratings on it if you'd like. Okay, so this is another slide that has a lot of words, but we go through quickly, so sorry. One of the major things that changes people's mind or decides for people is how the length of our lives shape the meaning of our lives. And so the two things I point to here is how relationships would shift if you radically extend how long you live, right? For a lot of people, when we do surveys in a classroom, when we have a synchronous class, one of the major things that make people say no to whether they'd like radical life extension is marriage or dating relationships, right? What would marriage look like if you lived, say, forever or for 500 years, right? It would at least be a very different relationship. Similarly, this isn't so much a answer, to a survey, but parenthood would look radically different, right? You all have some kind of parents or you had guardians. How would that relationship grow? Like already you have the transition to adulthood with these people. What would the relationship look like when they're like maybe 20 to 40 years older than you? 20 to 40 years doesn't make a difference when you're like 500 and whatever it would be, 460, right? But then by that time you might have a 420-year-old, right? So what is that generational responsibility? What does that generational relationship look like? People aren't going to be in a position to advise you anymore at some point, right? So what does that look like? Also, you're going to have a ginormous amount of your grandchildren potentially, and great grandchildren. Okay, so the meaning of relationships would shift, and then also religious commitments correlate with prolongivists and apologists because the meaning of death does, right? So what kind of attitude should you have towards your own death? And typically that just is going to correlate with the afterlife. So I'm posting these slides, you can check that out or just consider the different religious commitments on your own and how they relate. Okay, so further correlations in what people's attitudes tend to be towards radical life extension is your current age. So younger people are more comfortable with it. Socioeconomic class, lower income folks, and then also people who have lived or are living in less affluent areas consider radical life extension to be more likely to have a positive influence on society. And then ethnicity, people of color are more likely to choose to live longer. So those are three different metrics, but those are the ones that have the strongest correlation with those identities. Okay, so how does that relate to our text? Because we're diving in this week and we're about to finish up this PowerPoint. So thanks for sticking it out. Or take a break whenever you want. I should have said that. So what are we looking for? Here are the three major themes. And of course, you can like or read for whatever you want, but I'd like to give us just a sticking point. And this is our second to the last slide. So I suggest that the three major themes here are like the ethics of technology and intervention, and we're focusing on radical life extension here. So radical life extension is a development in medicine say, and we can think about the ethics of it, right? Should we have radical life extension, basically here, right? So I break that down into 4 questions you could consider, but basically, like, should we have radical life extension introduced? What should the standards be? Is that number 1 question. Number 2, what are the ethical problematic things about radically extending your life? Would you choose to radically extend your life? And what is the difference? Is there a difference between radical life extension and the other stuff that we use right now? And I've mentioned like kidney transplants, using insulin as a diabetic, things like that. Okay, is there a difference? What's the difference between those 2 things? Okay, so reading the book, thinking about the ethical context of what in the book they call the cure. Okay, it cures aging. The other major theme, as we talked about on the previous slide, is how relationships shift, right? So already in the lifespan that we have, people have different attitudes towards the role of the major relationships I mentioned, right? What you want these relationships to be in your life is different probably than what I do, right? So think about what the most central relationships are to a meaningful or a well-lived life, right? This could you could answer that differently than other people. Think about how these relationships typically shape or exist in you or somebody's life at different stages, right? Infancy, different stages of childhood, adulthood, senescence, again, meaning the point at which we age, right? Some of them might not really manifest at different times, right? Like your romantic marriage time comes about in adulthood, right? It might take on different shape during senescence, the aging time, right? Whereas parents and friends might have different roles at different stages there, okay? If we were to radically lengthen our lives, how would those roles and meanings, the central choices that we have to make about those relationships, right? Especially those choices, right? Choosing to get married, choosing to get divorced, choosing to have a friend over and over and over, right? Choosing to be a parent, choosing to have more children, right? How do those choices, how do the roles of these relationships change if our lives are super long? Okay, then here's our literature theme. Okay, so we've talked about other stories and what the shape of the story, what the author's choices do to our understanding of what's going on. And so this is a dystopia, and we're being told what's good or bad, what's valuable in a society, and something is going to be going wrong in this story, right? But we're being told about it in a particular way. So let's think about how we're being told about it. Here's my suggestions about how to think about that. We're getting the story told to us by one person, so we only get one person's perspective, and it's conveyed in the format of a blog. So why? What's unique about conveying the story in that format, right? We get it through social media, basically. And also, what do we learn about the main character? He's choosing to include some things in his blog, not others, right? You've all written things on social media. That's different than what you are, what you exist as. Also, what do we learn about him based on how he's portraying other characters? Which events he focuses on, right? One thing we always should think about, and especially when we have just one protagonist, right? We see everything through John Farrell's eyes. Whose perspectives are we missing, right? So similar to Omelas, to the ones who walked away from Omelas, there the author herself was just telling a story focusing on some versus others. Here we actually have a character who's writing a blog, and we're missing stuff that he's not attending to or he's not deciding to show us, right? So just in virtue of him only occupying one space in the society, we're only going to get some information, but then also it's what he chooses to write down. So we miss information that way. So these are things that I think we can keep in mind. They're like points of entry for this text. Okay, so in other words, this is just kind of a paraphrasing, maybe saying it a little bit more clearer. These are major themes that can guide your reading. The first one, what's up with the cure? So that's the cure for aging. It's called the cure throughout the book. So you can just think about the ethics of technology. This is how I'm paraphrasing it. So what effects is the cure having? Do you agree with how the author is portraying what would unfold if the cure would exist? You can think about whether you'd make similar choices if it became available, right? So just thinking about the context of what would happen if something like the cure was introduced to society. Okay, so that's one thing you could think about in this text. What's going on with the cure? What are your responses to the cure? Do you think the author is saying reasonable things? Do you disagree with the author and how he's portraying society? Okay, that's entry point one that you could have, that you could just focus on that throughout the book. Entry point two, how would the cure change relationships? So keep in mind, so we don't get a focus on this all because it's John Farrell as our protagonist, but you can think about how many different relationships just are important in life, right? Friendships, parent-child relationships, lovers, spouses. How do you think the cure would affect them? And then what kind of effects do you see in the book, right? And would you have similar relationships, and would the cure have similar effects on your relationships, do you think, as they do on John's? John being our main character, right? John Farrell. Okay, so the second point of entry is just how would the cure change relationships, right? So just track maybe a bit about just examples of relationships being affected by the cure and your responses to that, your thoughts about your own, things like that. Okay? Second point of entry, the cure and relationships. Finally, the third point of entry, hopefully is kind of seeming not out of nowhere given how we've talked about other texts. What's up with John Farrell? Who is John Farrell, and how does that affect how we receive this text? So we're getting everything through his eyes. Let's think about his perspective as an intentional choice and what sort of person he is. I think we do this pretty easily, actually. So this sounds like the most abstract one, but for most students, this is really easy to do. Articulating it might be harder, but you are just kind of naturally getting this impression, okay? So writing it down or communicating it is another story. You can do it, but this is something we do pretty easily, just telling it. So what sort of person is he? So this is a blog, and we can learn a lot about people just from their blogs and social media, right? You all are good at reading social media and judging a person on it. I know I might be more judgmental than others. I don't want to attribute judgmentalness to you, but you're good at evaluating. You know you can read into social media a perspective of somebody. So think about what it means that we're getting John Farrell's perspective here. What are we learning about society through John Farrell? What kind of character is he? And what are we missing about society because of what kind of character he is, right? One of the things that I am always struck by is what he focuses on when he describes other characters. So that might be something you're thinking about. You can think about anything related, like what do you get out of John Farrell, and what do you think the author might be doing by focusing on that? But you can just say, hey, this is interesting. I know this, I don't know that, because John Farrell decided to focus on it. If you get a kind of like characterization of John Farrell as you go, because we jump in time, articulating the development of John Farrell might be an interesting thing to do, and there'll be various paper prompts related to these 3 points of entry. So I suggest these 3 kind of themes. So I'm trying to kind of highlight that at the beginning because I think these could be helpful. Okay, so thinking about the cure and the context of that, how you're responding to it, reflecting on it. Okay, thinking about how the cure relates to relationships, and thinking about what having John Farrell writing in a blog does to how we receive information. That's the only way we're going to engage with this book, right? That's the only way we get any information. Okay, so that's our introductory video. I hope you're finding this book interesting. It is very different than what else we read. Please feel free to reach out. Again, to schedule office hours, you go to the WebEx tab that is on the left. on Canvas, and you just see an available time and you click on it, and then that time's yours. I get an email and I'll set up the appointment. It'll be great. I'll set up the um, video thing. Okay, so send me an email if you're confused about anything. I'll talk to you all soon. Enjoy.